I'm good. Let's go. Let's do this. Yeah.
You sure? All right, let's dive in. I got pretty excited about Apple coming out of this thing. Like,
nice.
They felt like back a little bit, and it was nice to see. And it just reminds me how much sleeping on Apple is like a dumb thing, a bad idea. They will always be last. It will always look like they're going too slow, and they always do something a little bit different that feels really good. And like time and time again, people are just like, it's the end of Apple, it's the end of Apple. And they just remind you, like, that's our strategy. Like, we want to be last, we want to be slow, and we want to be right. And I can't believe we're like 3 decades later of like, Apple is over. It's just never over.
Relearning these lessons all the time. So deep agree. The last time we talked, I think my take was I wouldn't count Apple out. In fact, I think they're actually in pole position as owner of the device. And they've been setting the stage with all of their various investments, which they did a really good job of pulling together and making it seem like super intentional, which I hope it is. Sounds like it. But between the new chips being really powerful, their secure and private approach to everything, and then kind of talking about scaling that into the cloud, which is deeply technically interesting if you haven't gotten into that yet. Yeah, so all super cool, but they are always second mover. And I think the reason they're always second mover, beyond it being their official strategy, is because Apple doesn't like changing people's habits because of how hard it is to turn that kind of ship. So best let other companies find the terrible UX patterns that Apple's not going to do so that they don't have to suffer that, which is a bit of a blessing and a curse. As a mixed feeling owner of an Apple Vision Pro, it's like clear to me that if you had a startup iterating the snot out of it with the kind of hardware quality and the vision they have, it would actually be much further along. But it's not. And I know it's just going to take years because they don't move ships that quickly. But but overall, the momentum was really exciting to see. And I had that same kind of, oh, wow.
Yeah, I think overall, highest level impressions. I think that way that they vision set, where it looks obvious and intentional what they're doing based on the layers of the smaller things they've done in the past, is always such an interesting bit about Apple. Like a sort of small example of this, and I think I brought this up before, is when they switched, they added the fingerprint ID, the touch ID thing to the phone. It looked silly, right? It was like entering a passcode's not that hard. And then they added the fingerprint ID and you're like, okay, whatever. Oh, and then they were late to NFC and late to like payment stuff. And then they're like, oh, but we're going to integrate Apple Wallet. And then it was like Face ID. And then it was like, oh, all of a sudden everybody's buying everything with their phone, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of waited the right amount of time. They waited for the tap interface to become more ubiquitous. They were a little bit late. And all of a sudden, each of these pieces they were doing up before that, because I think there was, because also Wallet for things like tickets and stuff like that seemed sort of silly when it came out too. I remember a lot of people were panning it like, this isn't a big deal. Like, why do I care about Passport? I think they called it at the time. But then it was like Touch ID plus Passport plus more ubiquitous tap to pay equals Apple Pay. And all of a sudden we're running the table on it.
And not like that, it's like when I go places, I'm like, oh, can I? And they don't say like tap pay. They're like, Apple Pay? Absolutely. I'm like, okay, great. Sure. Yeah.
And so all of a sudden it's like, oh, it's like beautiful product sequencing where each step looks sort of small, but what it adds up to after 3 or 4 releases is something really valuable. And I think you're starting to see this around some other pieces of the puzzle too. And it's just like, and it's not just software. It's not just hardware. It's not just like the hardcore silicon at the base of it. It's all of the pieces coming together into a thing. And that takes 2 to 3 years. And they find these ways to do small incremental releases.
Far longer. I mean, I actually we were joking earlier about maybe I should go work at Apple. I would love to see the high level strategy roadmap. I think it should be fascinating to see what they think is coming from a hardware perspective married with perspective on what's happening to software. Because maybe hindsight's 2020 and they're just making very intentional 2 to 3 year bets that stack and look like 10-year bets. But if you look at when did the new Apple Silicon start coming out? Like when did they start rolling their own chips in the iPhone? That was a while ago. And it's the predecessor to the M series chips.
Yep.
And now they're just killing it because those chips support low power, energy efficient, still powerful, can do clearly pretty interesting things with AI now. Secure. Gee, what a coup. It's pretty amazing.
Another good example of this like product sequencing thing is looking at the Apple Watch, which again, when it first came out, seems like a silly accessory, right? Had a little bit of fitness stuff and they leaned in really hard. And now you see it as the dots have gotten connected over time. They're like Maps has trails in it. Oh, well, we also track your runs. We also do all this really high-end health stuff. It just sucks in an ecosystem of other apps. And I think of it as like beautiful bundling. What they do is they have good enough stuff across enough different things: fitness, notifications, calling,
passwords,
some of the passwords, tap to pay, etc. That unless you're a super hardcore person who wants a Whoop, for instance, there's really no reason not to buy an Apple Watch and just have it do the 80% to 90% good version of all these things. But they've gone deep on health. And so we talked a little bit about bundling a few episodes ago with Mariah Moscato, and they're nailing the health and fitness super fan, like the person who really wants that. They've gone pretty deep there, even where like if you're super hardcore, the Apple Watch might actually be the best device for you.
Yeah.
And then it does everything else good enough. And so it's just like, why would you buy anything else at $500?
It's so funny because as a tech nerd and health dabbler nerd, not to the same level, but I have the Whoop, I have the Oura Ring, I have the 8 Sleep, I have the Apple Watch. You've only got so much wrist real estate, right?
Yeah.
The Apple Watch, honestly, it just hits, right? It just hits that kind of, that central point. Although actually, I'm glad you brought it up because when we get to talking about AI with Apple Intelligence.
Apple Intelligence.
Which I guess is still AI, different AI. I do think the watch offers some there's some parallels there with the V1 of the watch and the V1 of Siri and the V1 of Apple Intelligence if they're not careful.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to get into this.
So a couple other random riffs that I noticed. I'm just going to like rapid fire a couple of interesting things I noticed. The other one is they didn't say artificial intelligence a single time in the keynote.
Discipline.
Those two words
that takes discipline.
Did not come out. Whenever they were talking about features and apps, they said machine learning.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really interesting thing. Like no startup can resist the urge to call anything they're doing AI right now. And Apple at the top of the market is like, we're not even going to say those words. I thought that was fascinating, like so disciplined, right? Our advanced machine learning algorithms will adjust your handwriting. There is no other company in the world that wouldn't call that AI. Not a single company in the world.
Well, like every startup, you say the word AI, you're attracting investor interest, team interest, customer interest. Like you'd be dumb not to use the shibboleth of the moment. They didn't do that. And why didn't they do that? Here's my theory on that. Number one, it's the ultimate flex not to have done that, which I don't think is the reason, but it's fun. AI is going to be maligned with job loss, with wonky behavior, with all sorts of the open AI dramas. Privacy, exactly.
Privacy violation.
Yeah, data scraping, all that. Like all these sort of negative things. And Apple has more to lose than they have to gain from this stuff because, look, we're all in their ecosystem. You're going to get this functionality. You're going to use it. You don't have to think about, oh, I need to go seek this new AI offering. It's just going to happen to you. And so by just taking that out and saying, let's focus on the use cases, here's what you're going to be able to do with it, that allows them to separate themselves from everything else. And I think for the deep naysayers, their whole privacy, you're extending your privacy into their private cloud bit is not just like marketing brilliance for the deep tech folks, but truly a technical marvel on its own. They just get to distance themselves from all the bad stuff and just focus on the use cases, which I think is great.
Yeah, and I think they've also probably seen that AI implies some overpromise, underdeliver right now.
Which is still going to be their big problem, I think, actually.
Sure. But by saying machine learning, they like slide backwards a little bit from that and say, hey, this is still just code running on a machine that does some cool stuff. And like the same way it might miscategorize your cat as a dog, that happens sometimes. It's no big deal. Versus AI, where it's associated with things like hallucination or like telling you the wrong stuff, that kind of thing. There's like staying on this side of it. And I think their strategy is aligned around that, right? Because there's no co-pilot anywhere. I thought that was the other interesting theme. It's like they avoided all of the exception of Siri, and we should get into Siri at some point. I think that actually, even with Siri, they've avoided this "it can do anything for you" thing that AI is associated with, right?
Sort of.
What they've sort of. And what they've done is, for instance, everybody's talking about Calculator. There's no AI interface in Calculator. It's just Notes and Calculator can do things they couldn't do before.
Right.
And I'm sure there's LLM tech under some of this stuff. There's got to be.
Oh,
but they don't
100%.
care.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk about that.
I wonder a little bit, and it's funny, for such a fan of Apple, I feel like I should know this, but how did they brand Siri when it first came out? Because one wonders if they got pretty burnt by that and don't want to commit some of those mistakes again. Siri, this super intelligent assistant that, and I apologize to anybody from Apple listening, that from a consumer perspective hasn't seemed to get any better in the 12 years since it was launched. It feels sort of the same to me. I mean, I know it's obviously gone through improvements in voice in particular, but it doesn't feel vastly more functional along the way. And I can't even feel it incrementally. But I know when it came out, everybody's like, oh my God, talk to your computer. Like, this is AI. And I think it's interesting that they maybe leaned into it historically there, probably the same way Alexa did and whatever the heck Google calls theirs. I don't even know. And then have back
I
off
think
from it.
Who knows what it's called? It's changed names a bunch of times. So I think it's Google Assistant now. I'm not sure.
That's better. I think that Siri is about to commit the same sins that Siri did previously, but in new ways. And there's a lot of stuff they're talking about with Apple Intelligence. We should get into all the image generation, the kind of system-wide stuff, the GPT integration, which is fascinating. And I think maybe like has sort of like business monopoly game theory implications is kind of what I'm thinking behind that one. But Siri specifically, to me, is the big, big knot. And I wonder how well it's going to work in practice. I wonder so much. I upgraded all my devices to the beta the last couple of days, which it's not part of yet, which is I should have guessed. I think they even mentioned that. But I was so
There's a lot of stuff coming in the fall right now.
Yeah. Can I jump into Siri then?
Let's dive into Siri. Let's talk about Siri, because I don't have as strong of thoughts on this. And I'm curious your perspective on what they announced with Siri, and what I actually am really curious what you think the pitfalls here are.
The pitfalls to me are very obvious, and they're not actually that different from old Siri and Alexa and all voice activated interfaces that try to interact with humans in a natural way. And here's the big trap. Humans are incredibly versatile. We can communicate and understand a lot, and the machine can only understand a fraction of that. And that mismatch between the space of what you might say to it and the space of what it can handle is anathema, actually, to all of their human interface guidelines. Apple's been at the forefront of UX, and one of the big rules of UX is sort of like make obvious what your options are and what they're going to do for you. Right. That's it. Like UX probably can be summed up of like make obvious what the user can do. Set clear expectations.
Right.
But voice interfaces can't do that. They can't show you a menu. They don't want to read you a menu. You wouldn't sit around for that anyway. And so like our Alexa-ified home, which hopefully she's not listening right now, what do we end up doing with her? Turning on and off the lights, yelling at her, and setting timers for things. And occasionally adding things to the shopping list. I know she can do so much more, and they invested in this whole skill ecosystem. But we could not form the habits because when it came out, the menu of options isn't clear. So when you get frustrated, what do? You retreat to a few concrete use cases.
You get down to what you know works, right?
Yeah. So with my phone, that's setting timers. Probably the only thing I use Siri for is setting a timer.
Right.
I self-bleeped out. I don't know if I can get away with that here or not.
You can get away with it. Don't worry.
Yes. All right. Setting fucking timers, which is a shame because it's so good. And, Reminds me when the Apple Watch came out, which was, it showed so much promise, but it was so slow and so painful. I trained myself. This is V1. It's gotten a hell of a lot better.
Sure.
To do very little with it. So for the first like 3 or 4 iterations, I just didn't even invest in exploring it because it was so stilting in the first, exposure. So bring it to like Siri 2.0, Siri Apple Intelligence version, whatever they want to call it. I think it's going to be incredibly powerful, but you're going to have the same issues all over again, which is that expectation mismatch between what you think it might be able to do, what it can actually do, is going to kind of winnow people down to an even smaller subset. And that's a shame. And I don't know how you iteratively bring a product to market with AI that's voice activated if we're not there yet. Where there is, it's as good as a human.
Yeah, my take on Siri to date has been, it actually does a lot more than you think it does, but you don't know that it does.
Yeah.
But it is a limited menu. And if you ask things in the limited menu, it's actually pretty impressive, right? If you ask it like the weather over the next 3 days, it will tell you the weather over the next 3 days, and it will do it well. It'll explain the things that are most important. Is it going to rain? How hot is it going to be? Those kinds of things. If you ask it the score for a game, it will tell you, hopefully, if it's in its database of things that it cares about. And it'll give you like a reasonable update. Like it'll be like at halftime, the Celtics are up by whatever, that kind of thing. But if you ask anything outside of that, it either just like completely fails, right? Like it says, search the web, which in the places I care about Siri actually isn't a good experience. So I end up using Siri mostly in the car because I'm driving and I want to do something, text my wife, etc. Right?
Yeah.
And so you start to figure out what it's good at. You build your own internal mental menu. I think that's right. But discovery is really hard. And so I think that's exactly the case. Now they're adding a whole bunch of other stuff that Siri can do that I think what's interesting is it's not just a hands-free way to interact with your phone in the same way. There are some use cases they described, like that complicated email use case with the mom, right?
That's a great one.
Do you remember this? I thought that was great. But what it's saying is, hey, there are ways in which Siri will be doing things for you that aren't just because you can't touch your phone because you're in the car or walking somewhere or doing something. It's going to actually be able to take a couple of actions and do stuff. And it is complicated if actions are harder than answers, right? And this was the main thing I saw. They really leaned into actions, which I thought was really smart. I think it makes a ton of sense given what the phone does. They had this quote that I thought was really great. It was something like, the best thing to take action is already in your pocket or something like that. And that's absolutely true, right?
Should I go get my rabbit to show you why?
Well, the rabbit claims it can do this, but they already have all the apps. And all the developers are going to make intents for those. And it can already do these things. But what if there's anything we've learned from agentic behaviors so far, it's that anything that's like multi-layers of planning is really hard to execute well right now. It hasn't been done. And so I worry about a world where, like the first use cases they're describing are a little vaporware. I love it as a vision. I am worried about what V1 will look like and whether it will, like the V1s of Siri, feel like you have to narrow yourself down to where am I meeting my mom today? Because the multi-step planning is just like not there yet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. So like layering up back to that, I'm sure the voice recognition is even better still.
Yeah.
And, that's a problem that we keep getting better and better at solving. So awesome. I'm particularly excited for if I stutter or double back, it gives me some space to breathe. Whereas these devices are constantly interrupting me because I'm formulating my thoughts from a blanket UX, regardless of what the menu turns out to be. Incredible, massive improvement. I think I'm going to feel that one probably the most.
Okay.
And then you get into what you described, these complicated, actions. Agentic long-range planning, super challenging problem right now, kind of unsolved. Like lots of reasons to be hopeful, but we're not there yet. We're just not. Yeah. So the vision's fantastic. But I think it's actually this is where I think Copilot, Apple's never going to do, never. We already know they're not doing this, but they're not going to do a on-screen Copilot. There's not enough real estate. Is that a model you want to interact with? Does that seem more complicated to the average person? Probably. It's probably not great. On the other hand, it starts letting you sort of see where things go wrong and see what the quality of it is versus like, okay, I've scheduled a calendar event for your mom and, this other person named MoMA and like, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, oh God, now I've sent out, 30 invites to this thing I didn't intend because it went haywire and I had no ability to kind of watch it do what it's doing. So here's kind of the sequencing I expect. Getting the intents out so that developers can build against it is like the number one thing you'd want to put into the OS as fast as humanly possible.
And that's why this is announced at WWDC, by the way, versus in one of their other launch events, right? Is they need developers to buy into this ecosystem.
And what we in the future, Siri could auto-navigate, arbitrary apps and control them, but we are not there yet. Like the world is not there yet. So having developers expose a limited vocabulary, and Apple has all sorts of history with this, APIs and Apple script on, the Mac and all that. Like they know how to create.
And Siri has had intents for a while, right? Like it's had ways to do this. Yep.
So that makes a ton of sense. That gets people starting to contribute their actions to this library. Ironically, the more actions you have in your library, the harder it is for an agent to navigate it, right? Agents are very good at like choosing between 5 actions, not 50 actions. So that'll be interesting, especially when apps are competing for intent.
Right.
Yeah,
is like
that the new frontier?
DoorDash, Uber,
order me food.
DoorDash, Uber Eats, and Caviar, Caviar and DoorDash are the same, but what is like, which one are you trying to order from? Is it going to ask you? Is it just going to take the action? Do you have to pay to be prioritized? How's that going to happen? I think it's really, really interesting.
But that'll be fun to watch play out. But I really get into this menu problem. It's the menu problem with higher expectations, higher possible results, but that creates a much more kind of volatile, feeling when it goes wrong. It's one thing when the thing that doesn't set my timer goes wrong or tells me that the sports team thing. It's another when I'm saying like, hey, can you schedule this with my mother? And then like, God only knows what happens. And then I've got to like, try to re-explain or even like
or fix
diagnose.
It
yeah, exactly what it did. So like, I want to live in the world where that works. And I know it can work in the future. It's just a question of like, how do you iterate there? What a freaking tough challenge. So, back to earlier, like no wonder they weren't first on this. And maybe they'll slow roll this. I think that, the rollout for this was not going to be everybody in the fall, at least not for all the features.
Right.
One only knows how much testing they're doing with this right now. Again, would love to be on the inside and seeing this. But this to me seems like, I'm sure they're going to create some very powerful technology that the average consumer is going to struggle to figure out where the sweet spots are. Now, if I'm wrong, high fives all around. We're living in the future. And I know we'll get there, but it's not going to, I don't think we're going to be there, late 2024.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And I think some people on Twitter and stuff, Steven Sinofsky in particular, talked a little bit about how really what they did here was set a vision for what their version of Apple Intelligence looks like in the future. And they sort of like set some pillars. Now, who knows how well it's going to actually do? And I actually think this is really interesting because usually you don't see that from Apple, right? You don't see a lot of like, here's what we think 3 to 5 years looks like. It's sort of opaque and it gets unraveled a step at the time.
Yeah.
But I think they did do that here so you know what to expect from them. And they used a lot of like specific phrases to nail that vision. One is, this one's sort of adjacent to the AI thing, but they talked about reliving special moments like a lot of times, right? Around what they are going to do with things like photos, videos, etc., especially for the Vision Pro, but like across a bunch of other things, which I thought was really interesting. Another one is they talked a lot about personal context, right? That like what the device has is personal context about you. In a lot of ways, like Apple kind of owns the most valuable social network, right? Which is the contact graph,
like
etc.
The people I actually talk to. Yeah.
People you actually talk to, what you talk to them about. They know what your email is. They know what all your messages are. They've made iMessage a real platform, right? They've leaned into personal context in a bunch of different ways, and they're integrating some of these features into that. They are obviously leaning in really hard on all your devices looking and feeling like a single ecosystem of stuff that talks and acts together. Continuity is like one obvious little bit, and phone mirroring. But if you think about that in the context of Apple Intelligence, let's try to think about where each piece of this layer cake might add up to something. All of a sudden, it's like, I'm sitting here with a watch, a phone, an iPad, Mac, and it doesn't matter which device I'm interacting on, it knows where to go to do the thing, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's really interesting. Even the extensions and changes they talked about with maps, like maps, they added it to the phone and they added it to the web and to the desktop version, right? Like these kinds of things, you're starting to feel like, oh, this is one whole ecosystem of software that's designed to really, really work together and across all the pieces. And for developers, that's good too, because it means if you build something, it works for everything, right?
Yeah.
And so like, I think you're starting to see these themes that they're putting together. Privacy is another theme. You are going to own your information. We're not going to send it off to random clouds. And if we do send it to a cloud, it's in a stateless way. I don't understand the tech that well, but it really sounds like they've invested super deeply in making that a guarantee, which I think is really, really interesting, which no one else can do.
I think it's huge.
No one else can do.
I actually can't imagine people in the government using any phones other than Apple products at this point. But yeah, the claim, and there are folks who have gone much deeper than I ever will on this, is that if they were subpoenaed to get information from their little AI cloud, they can't deliver on it.
They can't deliver.
Yeah, and that's amazing, because I think if you start to have to play this game of, well, what can I do in these contexts if I care about my privacy? It just, any nuance to expectation breaks down trust over time. And they're working really hard to create minimal expectational differences. And that plays into the whole continuity conversation as well. It doesn't matter which of their products I'm using. I'm getting the same experience, the same knowledge about me, and the same power and the same, expectations.
And the last pillar that I just thought of, that it seems obvious through all of this, is this idea of natural interface versus just natural language interaction, which is where everybody else is kind of going, right? The Zig is these co-pilots that I chat with, and they could have gone that way with Siri. Like, talk to Siri, do everything, co-pilot for all of your apps, et cetera, et cetera. But their zag is sort of towards this, like, and I think this is what's so interesting about the calculator app and math notes, is it's really cool and really like probably a pretty niche product, but it is a vision for what great machine learning or intelligent interface is going to look like in the future, which is I'm going to do things the way I normally would, and it will intuitively layer in the places that make sense. I can write. I have never wanted an iPad. I take a lot of paper notes. That's how I live my life. That handwriting, copy paste, automatic adjustments, note taking, like all that. I was like, holy crud, like I should get an iPad with an Apple Pencil because it's a natural interface.
It made me want to go back to school just to take notes and be more productive. So
exactly. So I think that pillar of natural interface, they didn't say that word, but that's kind of what I've been thinking about it as, instead of natural language, I think is a really interesting one. Circling things and having them adjust, like this kind of stuff. Like that's their vision for what great AI stuff looks like.
Yeah. So, I mean, to your point about the Zig and the pillars and the vision casting, that's why they separated out their presentation, because they addressed a lot of these features in context, right? Your Notes app is going to be incredible. Your calculator, functionality like that is going to be great. Anywhere there's text, you're going to be able to do these things. It's just very natural additions, or, I mean, I that almost sounds like too casual. Some of them are very powerful in terms of how they work, right? But they're sort of extensions of how you might expect this stuff to work. And then over here is a big vision for the future. And it's hard, and it requires modern hardware and modern servers, and it's going to be super powerful. But I hope the asterisk is, and we're going to be very careful with how we roll this out, because God help us if, we screw up the menu problem or the execution problem or the privacy problem. And that's a very good separation and buys them a lot of breathing room. Interestingly, this is why I think...
so they say machine learning when they do the stuff they're doing now, and they say Apple intelligence for this future. And what they've done is they've given themselves some room to play, which I think is really, it's kind of smart.
And I think here's another brilliant move, if I can get like a little conspiratorial with it, the OpenAI integration. So first of all,
I want to talk about this because I was surprised by how they did this, and I think it's really smart too.
I think it's super smart.
What's your take on it?
The preamble, I think OpenAI has such incredibly powerful brand momentum around the worst name possible, ChatGPT, but so let me just throw that out there. I wish it were named something else. Anyway, I think it's actually really smart because Apple can tell their on-device fast functionality. It's going to be fast. It's going to be local. It's not going to go to the internet. It's going to work. If it's on phone, it's going to work. And if it does have to go out, you're going to know about it. It's going to be secure and private, but it's still limited, right? And then they're like, and for anything else, you can go to OpenAI. And when that thing goes squirrely, right, or uses your data,
Not our fault.
not our fault, right?
Yeah.
It's on them. But we don't have to lose this war to others who are experimenting much more aggressively pulling AI into the systems. And like, I've got a lot of desktop apps where I could double tap things to pull up AI and do stuff with it. Well, the average person is going to be able to get access to that in a kind of Apple-ish way, which is great, without Apple having to absorb the reputational damage of what happens if that thing goes wrong. Now, I actually have one more conspiracy theory on this. I wonder if AI is going to be the new browser wars and they're stemming off some sort of weird monopolistic, accusation. Should anybody, point this at them? I don't know that our anti-monopoly laws are doing much these days, but if having hot swappable, like giant cloud provider AIs is somehow meaningful to saying like, well, we're not trying to lock people into, the most powerful tech ever, you've got another little bit of an outlet there.
That was exactly what I thought was so smart. I was like, oh, that wasn't what I expected. I expected ChatGPT to be integrated into Siri.
I'm glad it's not.
But instead, it's like not. It is, but it's like a permission. And you can see how they could say, oh, you could do that in Claude or Perplexity or something else too, eventually, right? Yeah. And they left that door open. But they've limited their liability to what that thing is doing. It has given you the power, if you want Siri to be an answer engine for anything, to be able to do it, but in a way that keeps Apple's brand and interfaces and interactions sort of insulated from that. The same way if you have a crappy app on your phone, they're sort of like, we tried our best, but sorry, it's not our app,
One wonders if people will pay them for those positions, much like the kind of the who's the default search engine, you can make significant cash by controlling that prime real estate.
Yes.
It's not like they actually lose anything. Interestingly enough, like if you think, oh, well, the data is worth paying for, which it is, any giant model company should be deeply interested in aggregating all those queries to improve their systems. So Apple has something valuable that those folks want. They have something valuable that Apple wants, which is like frontier capability without the liability. And it's not like Apple gives anything up for that either, because they still have all that data. They know what they sent out, should they want to start trying to parse that themselves. So it's just a really smart move all around. I am glad they didn't bake it in as directly as I kind of assumed they were going to from the rumors. I think that would have been a mistake.
I'll throw out one other thing that's like not AI related for a second that I thought actually made me challenge some of the choices that I've made on apps and usage. There's a bunch of stuff that's going to work really well if you use Apple native apps for core functionality, right? That they were improvements. Safari, in some small ways, they ripped Arc on a bunch of stuff. That seems obvious. They're not afraid to be like, wow, that's picture-in-picture things way better. Let's just steal that. Those kinds of things. Having some summaries, way better. Let's just do that. But stuff around maps, calendar, email, core productivity suite stuff that I use day to day, I have chosen to do best-in-class versions of a bunch of different apps.
Yeah, your Notion calendar, Superhuman, all that kind of stuff.
It's like Superhuman, Gcal for me, Arc, etc. But if Apple really nails this down to the metal, all this stuff works really well together, it starts to beg the question, should I be reconsidering those apps, even if they're not quite as good? Now, I'm interested to see where that goes. My solution to this right now is I have Apple Mail set up with no notifications. It already knows what all my email is. I just don't use it for my interface. I don't do that with Calendar because Apple Calendar is really wonky and weird in some weird, ways. But will I want to give my phone my personal context that it currently does not have because I'm a power user who has specific apps for all this stuff? Because the vision of the integration it really is an Apple Intelligence thing. if I can't use Apple Intelligence because I use a bunch of other third-party apps, I don't think they're going to go there fully locked in, but I do think it will be harder and it won't work quite as well. And it does beg the question, will it pull people back into their core software ecosystem beyond just the OS?
This actually
It'll
is
be
a great
interesting to
point.
see.
I had that feeling a lot, right? Because I've used 1Password and I've recently switched to leaning in more to Safari's built-in password or the OS's built-in password management out of pure convenience. You know, like I was using Chrome. Chrome feels like spyware these days. I got off that. I looked at some of these third-party browsers and some of them are very good, but the native integration, kind of tilts me towards Safari. And Safari is sort of the most, compared to Chrome, privacy-friendly browser. So I've leaned into that. So that's pulled me a little bit deeper into their ecosystem. But same as you, I use a bunch of like pro power user tools where I can, and had the same question of, oh, wow, they're really doing more here than they usually do. Like most of the features that I've seen them add to Mail over the years are kind of stupid as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Like wonky little things I don't really care about. And so I'm like, I don't miss a beat. I'm like, yeah, I'm never using that app. And, between watching the AI integration, them fixing core user metaphor concerns that drove me to other apps, it starts to become more real. The question for me, I think, is like, what's their motivation behind it? And I have a couple of angles on this. One, they've built so much. What is there left to build? And I don't mean that flippantly, but like if you're Apple, right, trying to motivate the next cycle of purchases from your users, you've got to do kind of three things: fix bugs and speed, right, and battery usage, kind of like the forever perennial, keep hammering on that. You got to do the new stuff that pulls people in attention-wise, Apple Intelligence, whatever sort of big bang thing there might be, or scribble out formulas and they auto-solve themselves. And even if those things are like very niche, they are talkable. Like you want that iPad suddenly, right? And I just got the new iPad and it's fun, right? And it's really not that different than the old one, but whatever. And then there's the messy middle, actually, if we want to call it that, like where they can invest in their core apps to find reasons to keep people engaged. But are they doing that because they've run out of other ideas in those two quadrants or, thirds? Or is it a strategy to pull people deeper into that ecosystem to make that intelligence more powerful? I'd love to know the numbers. How many people don't use the default Mail app? It's probably actually pretty high, because I'm guessing Gmail web interface drives a lot of people's behavior. Because of that kind of that foothold. But it had me questioning all that as well, which is great for them.
If you think about the Apple business as a subscription that you buy once every 2 to 3 years by purchasing a device, right? They have iCloud and services and that kind of thing. But if you just think of it fundamentally as I think Ben Evans sort of coined this. The idea is it's a country club I join by paying $1,000 for a device, and my dues are that I replace that device on some cycle, right? Then what I get is access to the full suite of stuff that works together. And I can become a higher tier member by buying an iPad, a Mac, etc. Then the levers for growth are buying multiple devices, right? That's why the AirPods exist and the headphones that you're holding. They're making the things work well together, so that once I have one of the things, it's silly for me to make a decision to buy someone else's version of the other things.
Right.
And deeply integrating all of the software so it all just kind of works magically together, right? And then just deepening to leave, there's still space through the developer ecosystem for me to be able to upgrade my life, right? By going to Superhuman, right? For my email. But I get a lot of stuff out of the box, right? It's just like a bundle strategy. It costs me thousands of dollars to join this thing, and there's some upgrade cycle. Now, I am on a shitty iPhone 12, and I have been for a long time, and it is cracked, and I still haven't upgraded it, right? And why? Because I don't see a lot of upside, right? Like my entry into my experience in this club doesn't improve a ton by going there. And so what they have to do is lean in on software and lean in on the software side. And that requires higher hardware capabilities. So I'm unlocking new capabilities as I go up, right? And they've done this with the camera for a long time, and that's made a lot of sense. But we're kind of reaching the edges.
They've S-curved it out, right?
That's curved it out. So it's got to be on this intelligence stuff that I think they will continue to layer that up.
The frontier is exactly that, which is The hardware of the iPhone, and I'm sure someone will tell me, I'm wrong on this, but they can stuff it because proof's in the pudding. Like we've S-curved out on battery, screen, storage, anything you might, connectivity, like it just doesn't matter to go one iPhone to the next. I like paying my dues to the country club because I have like some sort of hole in my ego that needs to be,
that requires the newest thing. Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
But like I also logically know it's not really doing much. Up until now, you've got a few new axes that Apple can open up in big ways. One of them being, listen, Freed, sorry, dude, you want Apple Intelligence? You don't have the right friggin' chip for it at this point. And that's a credible claim, actually.
It's a very credible claim.
It's a credible claim. So they could just literally just withhold it for certain chip versions almost arbitrarily. And you would probably upgrade for it. Like it'd be foolish not to, right?
Yep.
And
there was a point when Face ID was a reason to upgrade your phone because
absolutely.
At the beginning it looked kind of silly, but then when you're paying for stuff, you're like, I'd be crazy to not have this, right? My Face ID did break for like a little while because I think the phone got wet or something. And I was like, oh, now I need a new phone. Like I literally can't live without this, that kind of thing.
And the second frontier for compute, because I actually think a lot of what I just described is true now on the desktops and the laptops as well. Like the new Airs are incredible. Like the studio is overpowered for most people who would be buying any sort of desktop. Like they're overachieved on every dimension. The only new frontier where they're very far from being S-curved out on is, the Vision. The Vision is really interesting in that I love that Vision's vision. And if you want to know what contextual AI is going to do in the future, when it can see everything you see also, in addition to the screens, like, holy hell, that is very far from even the beginnings of that curve up. Like they actually just said now is an interesting time just to even get on this wagon at whatever scale, as minor as it may be to Apple, to learn about the shape of that curve so that we don't miss out on, our bread and butter, which is not the first third, it's the 2/3.
Yep.
But outside of that, we're cooked out, right? Like we're overcomputed in a lot of ways. So thank God for AI, I suppose.
Yeah. They are doing an awesome job of picking off the things that are happening in the developer ecosystem that should be part of the core operating system experience. That writing stuff, it makes a ton of sense that making my writing better should live in the operating system because you write in every app in the world, right? Yeah. Like highlighting, change the style, etc. Proof's in the pudding. No idea how well theirs is going to work versus other people's. But as a developer, they kind of just took that away from like companies as a differentiator because they're like,
spell
honestly,
check 2.0.
It should just work on my computer like spell check does, right? Like, yes, I think that's a great analogy. It's like really cool that you wrote a word processor with spell check, but frankly, you should have spell check in every single app that you're using, right?
Yes.
And now I do. Yeah. And I spell check in Slack, and now I can like tone adjust in Slack and in my email and in a web browser and everywhere else. What they've done with the camera stuff to like integrate backgrounds and, their camera tech to be able to work with any Zoom huddles, etc., is actually what I want. I hate that Riverside can't do the same stuff that Zoom can, etc. That should just be part of the OS. It should be deeply integrated no matter what camera I have. Just put it in everything. Passwords is another good one. I never used browser passwords because I use 1Password because I have a lot of different stuff that needs passwords. It needs to be not necessarily at the OS level, but at a level above any single app, right? Yeah. To be useful. It needs to be across everything. And they're like, well, if everybody's installing a password manager, shouldn't the operating system just use the password manager? And now, we made it work on Windows too. So actually, like, no matter what, you can use our password manager. Right. Like, smart move, because that would keep me from doing it. What if I end up with a Windows device? I don't want to be stuck. They are doing a great job of yanking the stuff that really should work on everything into the operating system.
It's interesting because I don't have like a crisp articulation for when something should be in the OS or not. But when we first saw spell check in the wild as a technical possibility, like same vibe, of course that should be everywhere. And the only way to do that without hacking your operating system is to put it, in a fundamental level. There's a lot of great app software that's come out over the years that takes advantage of weird hacks to make things work for you, like the way 1Password integrates with your browser via an extension.
Yeah.
Ironically, that actually makes your browser less secure in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it
right?
sure does.
You've created a new surface area. And so getting some of those things in at the OS level, at first, it feels a little anti-competitive, though Apple did try to open up the password injection to multiple services, which on my phone for a long time used the integrated 1Password via Apple's OS integration. Much better. It helps privacy. They're not trying to control what software I use, but they're trying to bring blanket level, default good compute hygiene to everybody.
Fact is, my mom, my kids don't use password managers. Guess what they're going to do?
They're going to use
Once
this.
it's integrated, they're going to use a password manager, which is good for everybody.
And they should,
right?
Yeah, it's good for the world.
They should,
right? So actually, the private relay with Apple too. I think that gets enough attention as being like a really pro move on their part. If you ever signed up for a service with one of those things, the AI stuff, that there's a lot of people. I would love to see the data that they have on this, but switching between apps furiously to kind of hobble the stuff together. So just from like a productivity boost, it makes a ton of sense. I'm very excited for all that. I think all of that's good slam dunk stuff. And it's the reason it appeared earlier in the WWDC presentation, where it's the like more experimental big vision stuff, where you start getting into Star Trek mode, which like, do I even need to look at my phone, or am I just talking to, my headphones, which go to my watch, to the cloud, or God knows what, right? That's a smart separation. I think the rapid fire dumb stuff, it's like return of clip art though, a little bit. They always launch these like doofy dadcore things, and like we have 5 more new options.
The Avatar thing was like real weird. Mom superhero or whatever that image was, or the birthday
but you know what? Like if you go to Facebook for like the 10-year older crowd than us, I don't know, man. I think it's gonna hit. So
that's fair.
It's gonna be popular. That stuff, I think that's just sort of cheeky things that people can use, these little talkable moments. And if it's a viral moment, say, oh, how did you do that? Well, I'm on the new iPhone. Like that they win. So these were all very sane additions with this one carve out for more wild future, which I think is going to be really hard to get right. We're going to get it right eventually, but they've done a good job of creating a little bit of breathing room for them, which is not something you can do easily when you're a company at scale. Like actually, just to riff on this real quick, let's contrast that with Google and Microsoft, which not only went whole hog into AI, but way more than even I'm an aggressive person. I wouldn't have done what they've done, shipping the stuff, as is, right? And you're seeing a lot of weirdness. Google searches telling people to jump off bridges. Bing's been racist however many
rocks
times
to get calcium, whatever those things are, right?
Yeah, right. And so they've gone whole hog in this desperate attempt to, be at the forefront. And for what? A lot of reputational damage. These companies have a lot to lose. And Apple has very smartly navigated this. Maybe in hindsight, maybe it was obvious to, a bunch of folks up front. But I don't know that I could have hoped for a better WWDC. Even much of my misgivings about the vision they're clearly addressing. I don't like the timelines because I'm using it today, but I think they did a great job. So I'm excited for them. And I want my phone to be world-class at AI. Because if it isn't, what are we doing here?
I feel like if we took the bear case for a second, the search we've talked about a ton. I don't think we need to get into it. Has a big, wide open backdoor that makes them threatened, Google, et cetera, based around answer type engines and LLMs solving a lot of these things and crushing the business model of search ads. That's well documented, makes sense, and it's a real backdoor. The backdoor for Apple that makes them, flank strategically vulnerable is if I can do more with AI type features. The fact that I have this super high powered device that has all these apps on it and all these things becomes less and less valuable because the cloud can do more, because LLMs can do more, because it's not about an app ecosystem anymore. It's about an action ecosystem, right? It's I want, a burrito delivered to me.
I was just thinking that.
Get me a burrito. And it's what kind of burrito do you want? This one. This one's open. Great. And this lightweight phone, this is what people have talked about as maybe OpenAI's phone idea, et cetera, the Rabbit, Humane. There are a lot of different takes on this. No one's obviously there yet, but it is a threat. And what they sort of did was say, it's going to be real hard to beat us on this. We're not idiots. We're headed that direction. Right.
Yeah.
And we have all this other stuff that you're going to want to stick with an iPhone because it like shows up on your desktop computer. They're shoring up the basic flanks in a whole bunch of different ways and then being like, hey, and we're also headed here. So I think that's good.
They need that country club cash cow to keep operating until the Vision, which I think is the only successor to the current iteration of devices today that's going to matter. So like,
whoa, big set. Hold on.
Oh,
rewind.
Deep belief.
Explain that take, because that is pretty contrarian. Why is it the only thing that matters?
Yeah, actually. So let me build there as quickly as I can. Okay. The Rabbit, the Humane, they don't really offer they have a competitive vision to what carrying a device for you could be in the future. And I think interestingly for both of them, they can both see, right? Which I think is critical, right? However, building tiny portable hardware like Apple does is really fucking hard, and AI isn't there yet, right? And even if it was closer, or they were further along than say Apple on this, which technically they were, you still suffer from that menu problem and all the other use cases you give up without the screen.
Right.
So they're kind of in a no man's land where it's like, look, you're not wrong. A different device could obviate the need for all these apps and this complexity that we have when you just tell a computer what you want and it gives it to you. I believe that world, right? But in the meantime, you're going to need a screen, you're going to need battery life, you're going to need expectations and power and ecosystem, and they have none of that.
Yeah.
But by that vision, I do believe there's a hole in the future coming when you can have something take action on your behalf. Now, to take action on your behalf in the best possible way, not only should it know everything about you and be integrated to all the things that it needs to, which frankly, we can do more in the cloud these days because of how good internet connections are, right? So what's next, right? It's this idea that not only does it have your sort of software contextual data context, but it has your actual physical context. So this idea of augmented reality. And I think the two smartest devices out there right now, three, actually, I think Meta does not get enough credit for this still. It's the Oculus line, it's the Meta Ray-Bans, and it's the Vision. Now, why? Like when the Meta Ray-Bans first came out, it was really fascinating to be able to just take these videos of see what you see. And I know Snap pioneered this before they did, and probably others before them, Google Glass. But like they were the first to kind of really execute on it, worked really well. And then what do? Later, they dropped this beta where it can just like tell you what you're looking at. You're going to want to take a left coming up. How the heck did you know that? Right? And you can bring that intelligence in, or like if I'm doing a plumbing repair and it can tell me what I'm doing, right? It's because it's got those cameras.
Right.
Now, the phase beyond that is going to be, and it overlays information for you because audio is not a good menu. Visuals are the best menu system we have. And so this idea that it can see what you see, but still show you that menu and you can still interact with it with kind of voice, I think is going to be the thing. Like, I mean, just imagine for a second you had contact lenses that did all this. Like, we'd be all over that. Why would you carry a phone at that point?
Right.
You probably wouldn't, right? We're going to get there. Like, there's no doubt in my mind we're going to get there as a species if we don't, obliterate ourselves in the middle. So, but to figure out what those UX patterns are, to do it right, you have to be in the arena. And Apple is not great at being in the arenas early. That's not their move. Their move is to come in late. Right. But these are such a strategic upset for their ecosystem that I think this is one of those rare cases where they got into the arena early. They're paying the price a little bit. People like to mock them for what they've done. But if they keep iterating, keep learning on this, I actually think that this will be the ultimate successor, because you just wake up, you put on your Ray-Bans, you put on your eye glasses, whatever, eyesights, whatever they call them, and that's going to supplant so much. It'll be that and the watch and you're done. That's going to be the future.
Okay. Interesting.
I don't know if it's a compelling argument, but that's kind of the way I suspect it's going to go.
I can see that. I don't love that future. I will say personally, just like computer on my face, like stresses me out. Not a world I want to live in. I do think the Ray-Bans have been a really, everyone I know who has them speaks really highly of them. Versus everyone I know with the Vision is sort of is currently underwhelmed by them. And I think, again, it's this like hitting that right under promise, over deliver sort of thing. But I agree with you is that what you need to interact with a device really, really well is you need visual context, right? Audio is not a good like primary interface. I agree with that completely. Even with Siri, they're like, you can type to Siri. You're like, God thank you. Finally.
Right. Yeah.
Siri does useful stuff. I want to be able to type to it because I can't do it on the bus. It's like, and especially as it's taking actions, not just hands-free context, right? Like that's going to be necessary. You need something tactile to be able to interface with. So I think in your worldview, that could be the watch, because like there are still things you want to tap and interact with.
You saw this thing they got from, what was that device that Spark Capital invested in, the little wristband way back when? Great. Really cool stuff.
Like they have this kind of stuff. I think that makes a lot of sense. You need something tactical.
They pulled, the eye tracking and eye clicking you can do in the Vision. They pulled that into the iPad as an accessibility feature. I don't know if you're aware of that.
Interesting.
So like,
did not know that.
If they can normalize looking at things to take action, they're starting to train people up on this stuff long before they're going to have the $1,000, flavor.
Good call. So I'm trying to think of like the bear case for Apple a little bit.
I think the bear case for Apple is the one I'm most worried about, which is they're going to deploy some really sophisticated technology, but the average person is not going to be able to navigate it, and it's not their fault. It's just not consistent enough.
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair one. Yep.
I think the second bear case for them is one that I've noticed from them historically, which is my forever criticism of Apple. They're very slow to iterate software, and they're very slow to iterate UX patterns. So God help them if they get the wrong UX pattern, they hardly ever change it the next version.
Yeah.
Like you're gonna have to wait 3 or 4 versions, which is on the order of years. So they could be too slow moving to correct some of these issues. And in the meantime, installing bad habits that hurt them and the ecosystem because, people, once I realized Siri couldn't do everything I wanted to do, I stopped talking to it. And then it took me years to start even attempting to play with it again.
Yeah. I think, okay, so I'm going to recast that a little bit. Technology is moving faster than ever, and especially around AI stuff. And I think what Apple's showing is, hey, slow to launch is still our thing. Like we are still going to be last mover advantage in major things that we do. And I think what you're saying here that I think is interesting is, but you have to still be quick to iterate. You can spend a long time to get your private cloud in, put together and make sure it's got all its guarantees and that it makes sense and it works with your thing, and like get all this personal context and make sure you're driving these layers in your cake to do something great. But we're not actually sure what those interactions are going to look like and what good looks like. And so they do need to be quicker to iterate. I think that's an interesting piece of, not that we are qualified to give advice, but a thing to watch out for them. I think that's right. All right. Thank you for joining me on this quick riff session on WWDC. I think what was fun for me is connecting the dots to a lot of the things that we predicted. If people are listening to this and haven't heard it, we had a couple of episodes with Aaron earlier in the year. And one of them, we talk about our predictions for what we think Apple will announce when they announce. And honestly, this is the beauty of Apple. It's like kind of exactly what we said they were going to do in some respects, right? Privacy forward, on device, deep integration with the hardware, narrow use cases, et cetera. They did do a bunch of surprises. I think there are a lot of cool little surprises here. But in a lot of ways, what's awesome about Apple is they do exactly what you expect and they do it really well. And they seem to be just continuing down that line.
Very fun to riff through again.
I got a really quick conclusion question if we have 2 minutes. So given what Apple announced, is there anything that, like, if you were a founder starting a new AI startup, that you would change?
So if I were a founder, now that I've seen some of this Apple stuff happen and looking at some of the Microsoft stuff too, this idea that you can attach to the OS and add some smarts on top of it to do some basic stuff, I'd be very wary of doing that. I wouldn't build a action engine for your Mac. They're going to build a better version of that that's going to get 1 billion users before you get a bunch of early adopters onto it, unless you do something deeply powerful that not everyone cares about. You have to do things that a smaller subset of people deeply care about that Apple can't do. But man, if I were writing a writing assistant, I'd be kind of bummed right now. Right?
That's great advice. Actually, I'll double down on that because I've given that similar advice to B2B software construction to teams that I work with, which is if what we're working on is something that every other software company would benefit from also working on, we shouldn't be working on it because it means it's not critical, unique value for us. And there's probably a provider out there who's going to do it, and you should just lean on them. And the same is true. Is like, look, if every human wants the functionality that you're describing, you're either going after the single biggest like venture scale attempt to swing big and create a platform, or don't touch it, because the platforms are of course going to do it, right? It's the same dynamic. So the advice I gave before, which is just hard advice to follow, is if you're in the AI space anyway, if you're doing anything with that, you gotta be looking further ahead than we're used to, because it's not about just wiring stuff up really rapidly. Like, software is getting easier to construct than ever. 3 apps from well-meaning great indie developers that I pay for that pull up AI on the side or inject it into things because I live at the forefront bugs me, but like, they're not going to have subscriptions from me, in the near future, right? Those are gone. And, great for an indie case, not if you're trying to build a big, long-lasting business.
I've got one that I think could be interesting.
What's that?
I think apps with really valuable intents. A lot of people are thinking about how do I build AI, et cetera, but the AI's got to do stuff. And I think we don't have enough intents, as Apple calls it, or APIs, to allow agent, Siri, whatever type things to actually take real action. This is why the use case is always order me a burrito, because we're like, that's the best action I can come up with. So one thought I would have is, what is a set of things AI is going to need to do to be useful, right? Either in the real world, like deliver a burrito, or maybe in the digital world, go, ask a worker to do something. I don't know what those things are, but I do think that if you can start to build and get installed on people's phones an app that has useful intent, that are really high value, that people are going to want to have agentic type behavior do for them, I think there's a world for that. And it's funny because it's sort of an AI backdoor that I've been thinking about, which is like, oh, I don't have to build AI stuff. I have to build stuff AI wants to do. And you could actually get adoption that way. Now, I don't know what those things are. I would love to hear them from people. But like, my silly example is like, get a person to walk to a street corner and take a picture. Like, if you could like get a photo of anything anywhere, I suspect that would be useful for an AI someday, right?
Can you validate an AI just to render that on demand for you? But you're So it's like the gargoyles, I think, from which Neil Stephenson novel was that, where the average citizen's taking media all the time.
I have no idea.
On the vision, I think there are meaningfully good opportunities here, but they're not general productivity stuff. There's a horrific sci-fi novel called Mana, really short story that everybody should read. It won't make you feel good, but it describes a world where people have a little AI talking in their ear, telling them what to do their job. But it basically reduces the training costs, if you want to think about it more positively, down to zero. And I think there's something to be done there with Apple Vision or devices like it, maybe the Meta Ray-Bans, et cetera, where for a certain service or skill, you put this thing on and it guides you through it. And I think that works really well, whether you're an amateur, a novice, or a professional doing something more complicated, where for that particular niche, that service niche and use case, you're pulling in the context to get it done. The company that I looked at investing in a long time ago, interestingly, the founder of that is now doing AI and doing really well. This is Yanda over at Weights and Biases. Huh. But the company that he had before that, and I'm blanking on the name, but they were attempting to use Google Glass or its equivalent back in the day to help oil and gas workers operate this complicated heavy machinery by having the instruction manual in situ. Those kind of use cases, I think, are even meaningful for a $3,500 device if the service or equipment that you're dealing with is particularly gnarly. And it's, we're working on humanoid robots. We're not there yet. Those kind of industrial use cases or education use cases or service use cases, I think, are actually real, and you can make a business out of those. And if you're going to make a business like that, you should even consider pricing in the cost of the equipment for your customer to ship it to them. Like, that's the level of integration I would sort of expect here, and that would be meaningful. Short of that, though, I think it's still very early on the vision side of things.
Awesome. All right. That's a wrap. Thanks for joining me, Aaron. This is super fun. Thanks for going 15 minutes over, too. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we talk too much.
Always a blast to chat with you, man.
Yeah.